Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We are pleased to bring you this conversation as the second in a new series of online events powered by Ascend and AIAA. If you have any technical issues during the broadcast, please use the chat feature to contact the Ascend staff. And if you would like to ask a question, please enter it into the Q&A form. We'd like to offer a special thanks at this time to Lockheed Martin for their generous support as the sponsor of today's webinar and the cornerstone sponsor of Ascend. And now we are pleased to welcome Carissa Christensen and Christian Davenport.
Hi, thanks so much for having us, and thanks to the organizers of Ascend to do this virtually. Such a treat, and it's my personal pleasure to be here with Carissa Christensen, founder and CEO of Bryce Space and Technology, but really an entrepreneur in her own right who's started several of her own companies on her own. And it's a real treat for me because Carissa is one of the first person that I call when I do my reporting for the Washington Post. As I mentioned, I'm Chris Davenport, a reporter at the Post and author of The Space Barons. And I guess, Carissa, since the title of this webinar is talks about the $1 trillion space economy, I wonder if we should start there and kind of open that up. I mean, you hear that number a lot. I'm sort of curious, where that number in your mind, where it comes from. What is the possibility of eventually at some point hitting it? And what will it take to have a $1 trillion space economy for real?
Hi, Chris. I'm so pleased to be here. I've been attending AIAA conferences for my entire career, so I'm thrilled to be part of the revitalized and enhanced Ascend conference. And I've spent my career assessing the space economy, forecasting, analyzing, trying to understand its dynamics. So the $1 trillion space economy, I think, is a convenient metric indicating substantial growth and magnitude. What is it going to take to get to a $1 trillion space economy? $100 billion markets that are growing. And those markets, and we have a few, those markets either need to be able to compete with terrestrial alternatives. Direct-to-home television is a good example of a space market that does that, competing with cable television in terms of price and product offerings. Or that market needs to do something, use space assets to provide a product or service that is unique to space, that can't be duplicated terrestrially in any feasibly. And GNSS products and services are a great example of that. They take advantage of the ubiquitous position, navigation, and timing information from GPS and other GNSS satellites. And both those markets are value added, meaning they're the space asset plus additional capability or value. And that's likely to be the feature of markets that take us to the next level of the space economy.
So I wonder, when you talk about the space economy, I think you and I, we sort of just assume that's sort of a self-sustaining space economy. But in so many facets of the space economy, it's not. It's dependent on the government as, the predominant customer and the driving force. So how do we get to a point where there is really a self-sustaining economy? And I understand that's sort of a really broad question, and that there are a lot of different sectors that go into that, and we'll open those up a little bit. But I thought, from 50,000 feet, if we take sort of the broader view of that at first.
Sadly, we only have, a half an hour because we could go on this topic for several days. I think the first thing to note is the space economy has segments, some of which are self-sustaining in the respect that you mean. They're commercial. They are driven by commercial supply and demand. And while government is relevant, government is not the primary customer. And really, satellite telecommunications falls into that category. Television and video are major global markets that drive those industries. Thinking about other elements of the space economy, for example, exploration-related or on-orbit products and services, the pathway there is, as I described, the development of markets that are sizable, and that means finding a customer base that can drive that growth.
So let's open up some of these individual sectors. Now, one of the ones that everyone's talking about are these constellation of satellites in low Earth orbit, or LEO. We'll try to keep this relatively acronym free. So you're seeing Amazon wants to do this. SpaceX is charging ahead. I think they actually even have another Starlink launch later today. What do you think about the viability of those plans to essentially put the internet up in space, and what would that do to the space economy?
LEO constellations of small satellites have been transformational in terms of attracting new types of investors to space, enabling new types of visions for new types of products and services. Those systems are not at the point where their business cases are clearly closed. They are a combination of visionary and early stage business. The two markets that they're seeking to target, speaking very generally, are markets that are currently underserved. And those markets are typically underserved because the economics of mass access don't work out for terrestrial providers. Some are underserved because of access issues. We'll put those aside. Markets that are underserved because essentially the supply and demand curves don't meet at the right point for existing terrestrial solutions are certainly a market for satellite systems. There, though, you have the challenge of accommodating the price points that those markets can support. And satellite systems are generally less cost competitive than terrestrial systems. Not always, but generally in markets where they compete. The other market that those systems seek to serve is markets that are supported by, served by terrestrial systems, and they're same issue. Can you be price competitive? Can you offer a product that is differentiated enough to command a premium, or that competes with terrestrial offerings and is cheaper? It's a better deal. That's a challenge.
So in your mind then, is the biggest challenge for these constellations just entering this market and competing with the systems that are already there? I also wonder, what about the challenge just on the front end of, producing all of these satellites? You're talking about dozens or hundreds, the enormous cost of getting them into orbit and to operating them, let alone the ground systems as well. I mean, it seems that on the front end, it's just a huge challenge as well. I wonder if you could address that.
I don't want to be, I don't want to trivialize those challenges because they are prodigious. They are engineering challenges, they're logistics challenges, supply chain challenges. That said, throughout my career, what I have observed with space startups is that they are highly likely to solve the technology issues that they face and struggle more with the market issues that they face. So while those are significant hurdles, from an investor's standpoint, I would expect those to be less of a concern than the market hurdles.
What about on the, we've talked a lot about small satellite revolution. I mean, you hear a lot of talk about that, but also that's sort of touching off this move for small launch vehicles. And I think, at one point it was like, well, you would know better than anyone how many different small launchers were under development.
Dozens and dozens.
And we've seen some of those do very well, like Rocket Lab, but others, crash and burn, to use a sort of a bad metaphor. But what do you think of that market as well, particularly as a company like SpaceX is coming in and doing rideshare as well? I mean, they saw this coming and acted, I think, really quickly on that.
The small launch market is a very attractive market for government users. If I have a science payload that I can design to use a smaller, take advantage of the smaller form factor, suddenly I can execute my mission for a launch price of $10 or $15 million as opposed to 50 or 100. From a military standpoint, my ability to rapidly respond with launches for a variety of purposes is enhanced if those launches are less expensive and if I can launch from different, multiple different sites. If I am a nation that is building a space capability or augmenting my space capability, a small launch vehicle is a much more cost-effective way for me to have an integrated space supply chain. So small launch providers serve the government market very well. I view them as more of a niche player in the commercial market, simply because the large constellations of satellites are so large that deploying them singly or in small numbers is a challenge, and the price per kilogram of a small launcher is typically higher than the price per kilogram of a large launcher. I would liken it to taking a taxi versus taking a bus. There are times when the taxi is absolutely exactly what you need. You need to go when and where, precisely when and where you want. There are other times where you would absolutely, choose the bus. And I think that we will see governments look at small launchers for a variety of purposes, and commercial users use them for niche applications like test and evaluation, possibly some replacements, and so on.
So, and these constellations fit into this sort of broader theme of the commercialization of LEO, right? The commercialization of low Earth orbit, and that's a part of it. But I wonder if we can just sort of take that for a moment, because as a journalist, I'm also sometimes sort of have a hard time explaining to readers what that even means. I mean, you hear the NASA administrator talk about it all the time, where NASA wants to be one customer of many customers in a robust marketplace in low Earth orbit. But to you, what does that really mean, and what are the markets that can sort of drive that?
There are different lenses to look at that through, and I think they're all important. One lens is the commercial crew and commercial cargo flights, which have demonstrated NASA's ability to partner with companies in an innovative way and get a good deal. I think when LEO commercialization is discussed, it's typically referring to the idea of manufacturing something on orbit, either for use on Earth or for use in space. And there, we currently see activity that is related to LEO commercialization. And it really is in the mode of the space side is an R&D environment for industry, which can conduct experiments, learn things, and then apply what they've learned to terrestrial manufacturing through simulation or taking advantage of that insight that they gained in the microgravity environment. That has value, that generates economic activity, but it doesn't generate the level of economic activity that I think people envision, which is there's a product that's produced on the space station or on a commercial platform, and it's so unique, or it can be manufactured so cheaply in the absence of gravity that it's viable for sale terrestrially. That certainly is a possibility. The more companies that explore that possibility, the more probable it gets. And I think that's one of the key elements of NASA's strategy, and one that makes a lot of sense, is to engage more and more companies in those experimental, those R&D experiences, to A, take advantage of the knowledge they gain there, and B, potentially identify something to manufacture on orbit. The economics of that are very, very challenging.
So just staying on manufacturing for a minute, because there was some news today that Made in Space, was acquired by, I believe, a private equity firm. And that Made in Space is a company that, I think they have a 3D printer on the International Space Station today, and they've got plans to do a lot of manufacturing in space, led by Andrew Rush, who a lot of people in our sort of corner of the world know very well. What did you make of that acquisition? What does that say about the larger space economy? And do you think that there'll be more of these kind of mergers and acquisitions going forward?
So Made in Space is a wonderful example, again, of NASA partnering with a commercial company to develop a capability that is useful to NASA and its mission activities. The ability to produce parts on the ISS as opposed to having to stockpile them or launch, send them as needed. The acquisition, I think, is quite good news. Generally speaking, in any industry, particularly an industry where you've seen an influx of venture capital, the metric for success is exits, or whether those are acquisitions or companies moving to become publicly traded. And so made in space, taking that step, I think is generally a positive sign. Of course, the details matter, and we're not sitting here looking at the term sheet. Generally speaking, I think that that's a good thing.
Oh. So yesterday, and just staying in Leo for a minute, I was talking to George Whitesides, and Virgin Galactic had just signed their agreement to maybe start identifying passengers to go to the space station. And of course, obviously, they want to be flying tourists on suborbital flights to the edge of space and back. But one thing George said to me that really stood out to me was, the last 10 years, last decade or so, we've seen defined by the small satellite revolution that we've been talking about. And obviously he has a stake in this, but he said he thought the next decade, would really be driven in large part by human spaceflight. And, we see that with Commercial Crew and maybe with Blue Origin and Virgin. What do you think of that from, an economic driving standpoint? And we just got a question about that on the chat as well, in terms of what role human spaceflight plays in the economy.
So currently, human spaceflight is almost entirely a function of government budgets. Even looking at the Commercial Crew and Cargo programs, the ultimate payer is the government. Thinking about suborbital commercial human spaceflight to start with, Bryce, the previous incarnation of Bryce, produced a report in 2012 and talked about that market and identified that as potentially a viable market. There are high net worth individuals with an interest in and the ability to afford short suborbital flights at a reasonable scale to support a business. And suborbital providers, in addition to Virgin, of course, Blue has entered that market. So I absolutely agree that as the supply develops, demand will be there. That's a space market where the demand clearly exists, and the challenge is on the supply side, and it is a challenge. It's a safety challenge. The technology challenge is enhanced by the safety challenge because you're carrying people. In terms of orbital spaceflight, that's currently, we've seen historically space tourists spend time on the space station and pay prices for the full experience, the majority of which was the launch cost from 25 to approaching $50 million for a 2-week experience. That's a contrast to the price associated with a suborbital flight, which has been at various levels, but say roughly around $250,000. But a $50 million experience is only within reach of a tiny number of people. It seems almost absurd to say, oh, a $25 million experience is much more economical, or a $10 million experience, but that is certainly the case. So at those price points, those are still very tiny markets compared to $250,000 that could move down to from the price of a house to the price of a car, which enables a mass market access. So I certainly think that commercial human spaceflight will be a defining feature of the next decade. I'm not sure that orbital commercial spaceflight will be at scale, just because even as the price comes down, it's still a very high price.
Yeah. So I want to remind people as well to keep, sending your questions in through the chat, because there's actually some really good ones. We clearly have people who know their stuff watching this. One of them, I think, actually is I'm going to insert here as we move, I think, from talking about Leo to, because I want to go talk about the moon and the cislunar economy. Is sort of broadly, because we've already just in 20 minutes here, Chris, gone on a number of topics, which I think shows how broad this is. So from your point of view, like, what is the space economy, and how do you even define that? Because space touches so many things in our lives. Even that little blue dot on your phone is coming, from a GPS satellite. So, how do you put, a barrier, bookend onto what is the space economy?
So I think the reality is it's a bit of a temporary term. If I said, well, let's talk about the ocean economy, and I included everything from cruise ships to drilling oil, that wouldn't be all that relevant to conversation. So the space economy currently ranges from GPS that enables logistics and mapping to New Horizon going to Pluto, to launches, to TV shows. It's so varied. So the definition that we at Bryce have typically used is a reliance on on-orbit or in-space capabilities to provide as a primary enabler of the product that a company offers. And I think that we will be in this temporary definition for the next decade or so, because this space is so capital intensive. Access to space is capital intensive. The level of knowledge and expertise that's necessary is very high. There's a degree of integration in tracking what's happening on orbit. Orbiting bodies affect one another. The supply chains are integrated. Governments pay attention to space in multiple ways. And so I don't think that we'll see a completely, those sub-segments completely disaggregate. But I will say we've seen it to some extent. There are, I think, people who've spent their lives in planetary exploration that don't think very much at all about communication satellites. And so, but to me, my very profound answer is the space economy is drawing on things in space.
Right. Well, I love the analogy to the ocean economy. That kind of cracked me up. Let's shift for a minute to the moon. And I know everyone is talking about, Artemis and that is human exploration, but, the CLIPS program is really interesting as well. And that's NASA's program to send, cargo and supplies ahead of a human mission, but also to do science there. And there's a company, Astrobotic, that just had a contract, and I think they're going to send a rover that will help scour for water. And John Thornton, the CEO, talked about the significance of the science of that, but also the significance of the business side of that. I'm just curious what you think. I mean, is there a real business case for the moon? And if so, what is it?
There absolutely is a business case for the moon, and that business case will change over time. Business case for the moon right now is I, as a company, may be able to offer NASA or ESA or another space agency a capability that either that agency had not contemplated that could enhance its mission goals, or a capability that the agency has defined as needed, but I can do it more effectively or less expensively. So a program like CLIPS that allows companies to participate, allows companies to innovate, eventually redounds back to the funding agency in that agency has access to innovative, to innovations. The next phase, though, I think longer term phase of a lunar economy where there are commercial companies and their customer base is not the government, is not a government, is not an exploration program. Their customer base is a consumer or an industrial user. I think that that's potentially visionable, but is not going to happen without this current stage. So I do think it makes sense for companies to be engaged in programs like CLIPS and to be looking at lunar activities. The end customer for the immediate future is government exploration programs.
And so you just saw NASA also come up with the Artemis Accords, right, to try to establish some rules of the road. You sort of wonder, though, is that an example where NASA's leading the charge and they're ahead of the technology and the regulations are there? Or do you think, there's this concern where the technology outpaces the regulations?
So NASA, of course, is not regulating. And I think that's very important. NASA is helping to shape norms. NASA is setting rules related to its programmatic activities. Other agencies regulate space. The Artemis Accords, I strongly support those kinds of discussions because what they're doing is creating a playing field, creating an operating environment where unnecessary barriers are not inhibiting the commercial development that is being envisioned. So I do think that those can have a positive impact. And I also, so this tension between a long-term vision and today's reality, this is sort of professionally where I live. And it's so incredibly important and interesting because without that vision of the future, that sometimes seemingly crazy, very ambitious, transformative vision of the future, without that, we have no space economy. We have no technology, arguably, but particularly we have no space economy. We have no space activity. And so that vision is necessary. It's arguably the most important thing. It has to be blended with, in operation and in actuality, pragmatic analysis around what's possible today, around where funding is available, around what pathway is reasonable to move toward that vision. And so I think that when you talk about the lunar economy, it's the perfect example of there's a business case today, which is relatively narrow. That business case today will help to enable that much more expansive vision. It may happen more slowly or more rapidly than people expect, but it's the first step on that path.
Yeah, so that was a really interesting answer. And there are a couple things in there that I want to just unpack for a minute, because on the one hand, it seems like the government is still driving the economy, but then you also talked about the vision that propels the economy. And I wonder if it seems like that's maybe less and less coming from the government, or when it does, that vision is changed every time there's an election and a change of administration. So it seems like there's a sort of a bit of a conflict there and a point of tension. So how do you reconcile those two things?
The dynamics vary in different parts of the space industry. So in, again, commercial telecommunications, that vision is shaped by industry, that's shaped by operators. When it comes to planetary exploration, that vision is largely shaped by the government. Increasingly, because of the influx of venture capital, because of the investment by billionaire super angels that have a vision, that have a strong visions around human space activity, that the plan, the pathway, is much more of a conversation as opposed to government dictated. And I think that is to the credit of all parties. And again, that I make it sound like everybody's holding hands and singing. That's certainly not the case. There are different visions and there's conflict around those visions. But the conflict is driving toward, the conflict is now perceived as part of a dynamic interaction that's normal and valuable, as opposed to the government decides and companies react.
Yeah, I'm going to go start for the last 10, 15 minutes or so, taking some of the questions that we're getting in through the chat. Here's a really good one that I may add a little bit to, and it talks about how do you the idea of privatizing the International Space Station, which, NASA sort of floated that idea a year or two ago. How viable is that? But also, I wonder if you could reflect on, because we're in the 20-year anniversary of ISS, being continually inhabited. What contributions has the ISS not just made to science and exploration, but to the economy?
Well, that's a huge question. So I will say that the ISS has contributed to the economy in a variety of ways. Through experimentation and test that enabled product development on Earth, in areas of protein crystal growth and areas of vaccine research. ISS has contributed to the economy in helping us learn to live and work in space. There's a huge amount of insight that has been gained that is absolutely necessary to any step forward that we as a nation or the world, other nations or industry might wish to take toward living and working on orbit. With regard to commercializing the ISS, that's, there are multiple pathways. So the ISS is a national laboratory facility. National labs are typically run by companies. They're funded by the government. They serve government purposes, but the government does not say, you know what we want to do is figure out how to run this facility. That is a sensible thing to hire a company to do. And that the terms on which you hire a company to do that can vary significantly. The government concessions in national parks are run by companies. So the model that fits the commercializing the space station really is going to depend on what piece of the space station activities and operations you're thinking about. I don't envision that it will be, okay, ISS today is an international asset controlled by governments, and tomorrow is a private asset controlled by company X. It will be a very incremental process. And I think multiple companies will participate in that.
So combining a few of the questions that we have coming in on the chat, I wonder if you can talk about space traffic management and debris and the effect that could have, which also sort of leads me to just think, here we are, and I think we tend to see space through, the lens of NASA in the United States, but, like the ocean, it's a shared commons, and that there are actors with whom we have shared interests and some who we don't, and that we may disagree with how to do all that. So I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit about that and how, particularly when regards to debris and space traffic management, how to ensure these economies and these businesses can flourish in such a dynamic environment.
Debris and space traffic management are absolutely global challenges and need global participation in order to achieve success. Debris is interesting because there are two very different categories from an economic standpoint. There is existing debris, sort of the existing pollution problem that can't necessarily be assigned to any individual actor, and the cleanup of which is not likely to be commercially viable. If you don't have anybody who's responsible for paying and required to pay, then you've got it's very difficult to build a business there. There's a future debris, there's potentially future debris, and preventing that debris or mitigating that debris to the extent that it's created, that is assignable to individual actors and therefore more feasible from an economic standpoint for as a commercial market for companies to address. So I think that's very important when we talk about debris. Those are very distinct dynamics. And space traffic management is really interesting related to what you were talking about earlier. So if very few nations can get to space and almost entirely government actors are controlling space activities, then it makes sense for government actors and historically the NASA as well as the military to think about issues of space traffic management, preventing conjunctions and tracking activities. As space activities become more commercial, that becomes something then that fits better in a regulatory environment, just as we regulate global air traffic. You certainly envision regulating global space traffic and on-orbit activity. And the model of managing global air traffic, aviation, really, I think, holds true in that this is effective space traffic management will require participation from nations around the globe. And that participation will likely be more or less effective and vary by nation.
Yeah. Sticking with the questions from the chat, what do you think about mining in space? That's the question. I may add a little bit to that and say, when we talk about $1 trillion space economy, a lot of people talk about, mining asteroids, and we've seen, various high profile attempts at that go under. But, what do you think of that as eventually a possibility?
So the bottom line, it's so simple at the bottom line, which is the business case has to close. The cost of acquiring, deploying a system, landing on an asteroid, acquiring whatever you're acquiring, and then selling it to whoever is going to use it, whether that is using that material to produce fuel on orbit, sort of for an ISRU market, or finding precious materials that are viably could be viably sold on Earth. If all those boxes are checked, then it's a great business. None of those boxes are checked at the moment. That's a very, very challenging business case. And that goes back to what I was saying. The companies that have tried to do things like that and not succeeded, that's not, to me, an indication of a failure of the space economy. That's an indication of the vision not quite matching up with the practicalities. And you always have to start with the vision. So I will say one thing that has been important to a number of highly successful space companies is the ability to find incremental sources of revenue. So instead of a huge influx of capital and an expectation that 5 or 7 or 10 years from now, you'll see a return on a very innovative product, the ability to offer, to receive a modest influx of capital and then build a business out of that and leapfrog from that to another, with another influx of capital to another business. That's a much more feasible, from a business standpoint plan.
It's really interesting. There are a lot of questions about Virgin Galactic. And I think that must be because, they went public and they've sort of become a proxy in a way, their stock price for what the space economy is doing. Excuse me. I wonder what your thought is about, Virgin Galactic and them going public, but also the broader notion of investment in space. I mean, because I think, for the most part, it's been seen as, for investors who can tolerate a lot of risk. And would that ever sort of go more mainstream? And then I think this is probably our last question before we'll wrap it up.
So investment in space varies significantly. Investment in a major defense contractor is not necessarily particularly risky. That's clearly investment in space. Investment in a satellite operator that's offering enterprise telecom services globally, that is maybe a modestly risky commercial investment, but there's been a model in the past where satellites were, it's not still the case, but satellites were fully leased before they were even launched. It's a capital intensive investment, but it's not all that risky. And then there's venture capital flowing into space to support innovative startups with that are seeking very high returns, and investors that tolerate an extremely high failure rate in pursuit of those returns. And that is just what you've been describing. To me, Virgin Galactic going public lets individuals behave like those venture capital investors. They're not investing in a profit and loss statement. They're not investing in predicted revenues based on a clear historical trend. They are investing in a vision, and they're investing in a company that's trying to realize that vision with a great deal of technical uncertainty, with market uncertainty, but with potentially profound consequences if it succeeds.
Yeah. So we just have like a minute or two. I wonder if you have any closing thoughts at all about the economy, where we are at this moment in time. It's such an exciting time. I can tell you, as a reporter for the Post, getting to write about this, I have, you know, the best job at the paper. But, you know, what do you think of this moment and as a springboard going forward?
I would say two things. That every single person listening to this discussion today falls variously on that scale of visionary versus practical analyst, and every single person is relevant to what we're trying to do, what the industry is trying to do. And so to me, recognizing the importance of both of those elements of a future business is really critical to the pathway to success. So I look forward to continuing to answer these questions and consider these dynamics as we see a continually growing space economy.
Oh, well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. You know, I'm so nice for me because I call you for advice on my stories and quotes, but also now that we get to do this in public for everyone. So thank you again. And Nathan, I guess we'll throw it back to you guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both, Carissa and Christian, for joining us today. And thanks to everyone who tuned into the webinar. We'd like to also thank our sponsor, Lockheed Martin, for their generous support. Please visit us at ascend.events for more information about Ascend itself, where we're going to be continuing these types of conversations and debates over the course of this year, throughout the November event, and then into next year. This particular conversation is now going to continue in 4 interactive workshops.